Hey y'all, you know what time it is. It's makeup and music. So I know you can hear the neighbor doing whatever he's doing. It's driving me crazy, but it's not for the whole video. I promise it's just here and at the end a little bit, but if you could bear with me. Zeppelin is epic. My 11-year-old son loves them. My husband loves them. I'm sure our parents love them. Like, they just span the generations. As always, I do these with all the admiration and respect that I have. I can't fit every detail into these videos, but I try my best to hit on the important things. This is also information I've compiled from various sources on the internet, and I do my best to fact check, but if I miss something, I'm sure someone will let me know down in the comments. All the products will be displayed on the screen, so let's get started. I had an issue with one of my nails, so we're not going to talk about her. Trying to remember to stay over to the side again. So let me set the stage for you. It's the 1960s. England had bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Yardbirds, all who drew from American blues artists, Leadbelly, Muddy Waters, Memphis Slim, John Lee Hooker, all for inspiration. A young Jimmy Page is idolizing Elvis and learning to play the slap bass as well as the acoustic guitar. Initially, he wanted to be a biological researcher, but by age 11, he was playing in a band, and by his 20s, he was already an accomplished session musician. One of the two busiest session musicians, actually. But feeling kind of stifled by session work, so he took a gig playing bass with the Yardbirds, who were huge at the time. And at one gig, when they were in San Francisco, Jeff Beck got really sick, so Jimmy filled in on lead. So Jeff Beck had actually had a meltdown and decided to leave the band. So Jimmy stayed with them for about 18 months until the band had kind of run their course and all the members parted ways. So when this happens, Jimmy decides he's gonna start his own band, and it was actually going to be called the New Yardbirds. And John Paul Jones, who had been friends with Jimmy, they did session work together, heard about this and called Jimmy and was like, hey, I hear you're putting together a band and I'd love to join you. John Paul Jones was actually a really good keyboardist and a great bass player, and he actually began playing piano at age 6. And he did session work for people like Rod Stewart and the Rolling Stones, so you can hear him on some of their recordings. So Jimmy and John Paul Jones are kind of doing their thing, and they're looking for other members. And initially, they approached Terry Reid, who was a solo act at the time, but they kind of told him, either you're in or you're out. And at the time, he had a solo contract that he didn't want to give up, so he turned them down and forever became known as the guy who turned down Led Zeppelin. So up next in their search for a singer was Robert Plant. Robert also idolized Elvis as a kid, and his parents wanted him to become an accountant. But he was not having any of that, and he actually left home at 16 to pursue music. So Robert's performing in various groups and bands, and Jimmy goes to see 19-year-old Robert sing, and he was really impressed by him. Robert had this incredible range and this really unique vocal style. They just immediately clicked. So Jimmy invited him to come to his boat on the River Thames, and they hung out, talked about all their musical influences, jammed a little bit, and they decided that Robert was the perfect fit for the band. And when that happened, Robert immediately went to his friend John Bonham, who was a drummer. Now, John made himself a little kitchen drum kit when he was 5 years old and began playing. He got his mom bought him his first snare when he was 10. And when he was 15, he got his first real kit. My son is 11, and he also plays drums and guitar. And I actually have a little video of him playing, so y'all can check him out. Now, John was entirely self-taught, and a principal once told him, you're either going to become a janitor or a millionaire. And turns out it was the latter. Now, at first, John didn't want to leave his current job because He was making decent money, but because Robert was so excited for this opportunity, it kind of made him excited, and seeing how hype he was, he decided, all right, let's try this. So the guys have their first rehearsal together, and everything just completely clicked. They gelled so well together, and Jimmy already had contracts booked as the new Yardbirds. So they started rehearsals and set out to fulfill these contracts that Jimmy had. But they decided they wanted their own name, so they chose the name Led Zeppelin based on the fact that some of the members of The Who were talking about forming another group with Jimmy at the time, and somebody said, that's going to go over like a Led Zeppelin. And so they had talked about using that as a name, but that series of events never happened, so Jimmy used the name. The band made its official debut at Surrey University on October 25th, 1968. Now, people were attracted to their sound, as is usually the case, because it was different. It was much heavier than a lot of the music out at the time, and John Bonham, or Bonzo as they called him, was an absolute animal on the drums. He was doing all this stuff on drums that no one had ever heard before. They were all incredible musicians, and Robert Plant, again, was just this amazing vocalist. But the problem was they were so powerful in sound and performance that anyone who tried to follow them paled in comparison intensity-wise. So they started a club tour of the US, and by the time they reached New York, they were a hit, and there wasn't a band around who wanted to follow them. Everyone seemed kind of tame compared to Zeppelin. So they returned to England, and they were a US phenomenon, but they didn't feel the love when they got home. The critics always kind of poo-pooed on Zeppelin in England, so after a month and a half, the boys headed back to the United States. Their second tour was during the famous summer of '69, and they played the same clubs this time, except now there was anticipation because fans knew what they were in for. So they played the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Fillmore, the Boston Tea Party, all the same clubs they had played before, and they were packing out the house. And what little downtime they had, they spent writing and recording their second album, and they were signed to Atlantic Records, and they would go do a show, they would get up, go record, go do a show, go to bed, get up, go record, go do a show. I mean, it was just this cycle until the album was finished. Now, they were actually offered $250,000 to play the Yale Bowl, but they turned that down in order to play the Bath Blues Festival. And much to the chagrin of the British music critics, it gave Zeppelin a lot of street cred to play Bath. I don't know why they didn't like them. Anyway, so at this point, they're becoming one of the most successful rock bands in the entire world at the time. On October 22nd, 1969, their second album was released in the US. It was called Zeppelin II, and Zeppelin II was an instant success with songs like Whole Lotta Love and Heartbreaker. And soon, Zeppelin II had knocked the Beatles' Abbey Road off the #1 spot. Now, Whole Lotta Love was too long for radio play. It was over 5 minutes, and we talked about in these how radio likes to keep things around 4 minutes. So Atlantic took the song, condensed it, and made it shorter for radio play. Well, this pissed everybody off in the band. And you have to remember, too, that back then, these albums bands were doing and artists were doing were meant to be consumed as a whole body of art, just like Ziggy Stardust that we talked about, or The Who's Tommy. It's meant to be listened to in its entirety, especially a single song. It's telling a story, it's painting a picture, and so they were not happy about this at all. Also, as we've talked about, the band got a lot of attention for their costuming, and Jimmy especially. He was wearing stuff like embroidery and sequins and silk, and things that had been traditionally feminine, but at this time, the more androgynous look was just kind of in. And most of the guys embraced this look. Now, Jimmy Page had an interest in Aleister Crowley that had people talking that maybe he was into black magic and all this other stuff, and that he was a Satanist, and to which he and his loved ones, including his ex-girlfriend, said was total BS. She said he was fascinated with the knowledge of those things, but he was never a practitioner. But it did start a rumor that Led Zeppelin sold their souls to the devil for success. So that's out there. Now, the band was rich, and they could stay anywhere they wanted to, but they chose the Hyatt House, which was just off the Sunset Strip, and they would rent out the entire top floor of Hyatt House, and they would have these massive parties. And Big Ed Sullivan, who was a guitar player at the time, a session guitarist, and had played with Jimmy, said that one time he went to see the guys and come to this party, and when the elevator opened at the top floor, he looked down and there was like a foot of foam on the floor. And he said he saw two naked girls come sliding down the hall on their bellies. They had quite the reputation for being party animals, among other things, and it seemed to be true, but they gained such a reputation when they would stay here that instead of Hyatt House, it gained the nickname the Riot House. So the band was exhausted after their US tour, so they returned home to England, where they took a bit of a respite. And Robert and Jimmy actually went to Wales, and they got this little house on the countryside, and it inspired them to write this more acoustic album, like kind of a folky sound. And this would be where they wrote Led Zeppelin III. So the band reconvened at Headley Grange. It was this ginormous 18th century mansion in the English countryside. And it was kind of a spooky place, they said, especially in the morning when like the mist would come in and all that. And apparently they had this black dog that lived there, and it had died right before they recorded, but it did inspire their song Black Dog. And it should be noted that for the guys who were such party animals, when it was time to work, they worked. They worked hard and played hard. I'm sorry if you can hear the dog barking. It's my neighbor. There's nothing I can do about it. The Chihuahua. So one of the great things about recording here was that it was just them and an engineer, and they could kind of record anytime inspiration hit. Trying a new cream blush. And another perk to this was that there was no producer looming over them. And so the end of October 1970, Led Zeppelin III was released. These little turds keep riding by on four-wheelers. I know it's summer, I know they're kids, I know they're just having fun, but... Now when this album was released, critics say that they were pandering to the likes of fans of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I actually have a pretty thick Southern accent, so when I'm talking on camera, I try to do my best to not let it come out as much. But when I say things like still, I can't help it. That's how I say still. I don't know. Still. Steel. It sounds like steel.
Why are you the way that you are?
Crosby, Stills, and Nash. So once again, they couldn't win with the critics, but I don't think they were that interested. I'm sure it hurt their feelings, but they were selling out shows, they were selling albums and record numbers, so, I mean, really, they were fine. So even though they couldn't get credit from the critics, it did help them realize what mattered most to them, and that was the fans. So after the success of Zeppelin III, Page and Plant once again went back out to the countryside in Wales to write in the same place they had written before. And then the guys convened once again at Headley Grange to record, and they recorded Zeppelin number 4. Now this is when and where they recorded Stairway to Heaven, and their engineer, Andy Jones, recalls them recording Stairway and said what would have taken any other band, 2 or 3 days to record, they did in like 2 hours. And he knew immediately that it was something very special. So in November of 1971, number 4 was released. Zeppelin IV was released. And they seemed to like these fall releases, didn't they? If you're a Zeppelin fan, you know that Stairway is like 7 minutes long. And after what they did to them on their other album, they released a preemptive strike. They were not gonna have them chop this one up again. Now back then, the acts were getting around like 50% of their shows, and their manager, Peter Grant, was about to change all that. They were famous for playing these like 3-hour shows, and he knew it was time for them to get paid what they were worth. And them being as big as they were and in demand like they were, he was able to get them a 90% cut of their shows. And artists had been being ripped off for years and years and years. And thanks to Peter Grant, he changed all that. Like he's credited with single-handedly starting the trend where artists could demand more of the door, of the revenue of their shows. And you still have people today where the promoter will get the largest chunk of the revenue and the artists get the shaft. So you have to demand what you're worth. Don't be delusional about it, but know your worth. So artists really do owe him a debt of gratitude because he changed the dynamic in this area of the music business. And since America had been so good to the boys, they embarked on another US tour, and this would be their 8th. 1973 saw the release of Zeppelin's 5th album, and this one had a name, Houses of the Holy, and it would be their first one with an actual name. And by this time, the Beatles had broken up, and Zeppelin took over as the Kings of Rock. So as the band is getting ready to play Madison Square Garden, they were staying at the Drake. And when the road manager went to get the cash that they had in the safe to pay the roadies and the production crew, all he found were 4 passports. They had been robbed of $203,000, and that is equivalent today of $1.2 million. Now my question is, why was everybody paid in cash? Why do we have $1 million in the safe in the hotel? Am I naive for wondering that? So the FBI comes in and investigates, and the culprits were never found. This was huge news, and when it happened, the band was kind of over it, and they decided to head back to England for a while and just chill out and regroup. So they spent the remainder of that year with their families back home in England. Now, the end of 1973 also marked the end of their contract with Atlantic Records, and it marked the beginning of their independent label, Swan Song. And actually, Bad Company was the first band to be signed to their label. On May 10th, 1974, they hosted a launch party for their new label. And around that time, they heard that their idol, Elvis, was playing a show at the LA Forum. And so they shared a promoter, and they managed to meet Elvis. Awesome moment for the guys because they got to meet Elvis and let him know that he was the reason they all started playing music in the first place. I'll share a little picture of them meeting Elvis. On February 4th, 1975, Zeppelin released their 6th album. It was a double album called Physical Graffiti, and this was the first album on their new label. And it quickly rose to number 1 on the charts. So the band settled into Malibu, where they began writing their next album. And in 1975, in November, they went to Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany to record, and they knocked out the Presence album in 18 days. And it was around this time the band hired Joe Massett to make a movie about the band on the road. And there had been movies made, but those were more like concert videos, if that makes sense. And the band was interested in more of a documentary about, life on the road, what it was really like being them. And so the film, The Song Remains the Same, came out, and it was a big success for them. So by 1976, the guys were literally on top of the world. things were going awesome for them. But soon a series of tragic events would unfold. Robert had gotten into a really bad car accident with his wife and kids while on vacation in Rhodes, and he sustained some pretty bad injuries. He had a broken elbow, a broken ankle, spent some time in a wheelchair because of that, and it took a couple years to heal. And of course, he had begun taking some pretty heavy painkillers when that happened, so he was beginning to have a bit of an issue, and he'd been taking some other drugs. And on July 25th, 1977, while the guys were in the US, news came from England. His wife called him to tell him that his son was ill. And then the next call he got was that his little boy had passed away, and he was only 5 years old. And little Carrick died from a stomach infection. And of course, Robert was devastated. And the band told him, take as much time as you need. I mean, that's really every parent's worst nightmare. So the tour was canceled. Everyone flew back to England, and he spent some much needed time with his wife and kids. And he decided that day that was it with the drugs. So Jimmy Page was also indulging in some recreational drugs, and John Bonham had developed a serious drinking problem. And at one gig, he collapsed on stage and had to be carried off. So things weren't going too well. But they eventually reunited to record their 9th album. They released In Through the Outdoor in '79, and it would sell 5 million copies. And despite all their success, Bonham was still drinking heavily. And they say he had kind of like a split personality. Like when he was sober, he was like this big teddy bear. I mean, everyone liked him. Everyone had all these great things to say about him, unless he was drunk. And then it was a problem. He was just doing the most when he was drinking. He was loud and obnoxious and just not at all like his personality when he was sober. His road manager said at that point he didn't want to be on the road. He wanted to be at home with his wife and kids. He loved his family, loved being a dad, was an excellent father. And I think at this point, he was just kind of over being the rock star. So by September, they're in rehearsals for their next album and tour. And on September 24th, 1980, they picked up John for rehearsals, and he made them stop for breakfast, and he started the day with 4 quadruple screwdrivers. Have vodka in them. Lots of it, apparently. It was quadrupled. I think I need another Urban Decay perversion liner, guys. It is down to the nub. So as they're rehearsing, John is throwing them back all day long. And after rehearsals, they all went back to Jimmy's house in Windsor and just kind of crashed there. And John passed out on the sofa, so they put him to bed. So it was actually John Paul Jones that went to wake him up, but John had died in his sleep. He was only 32 years old. At the time, no one really knew why he died. They knew he had been drinking all day. He consumed the equivalent of 40 shots in a 12-hour period. And his actual cause of death was pulmonary asphyxiation. He basically choked. He got sick in his sleep, choked. That's how he died. Robert Plant described John Bonham's frame of mind that day while they were rehearsing, and I'll read it. He said, "On the very last day of his life, as we drove to the rehearsal, he was not quite happy as he could be. He said, 'I've had it with playing drums. Everybody plays better than me.'" John was arguably the greatest rock drummer of all time. So can you imagine feeling like being the greatest and still feeling like you're not good enough? We were driving in the car, and he pulled off the sun visor and threw it out the window as he was talking. He said, "I tell you what, when we get to rehearsal, you play the drums and I'll sing." And that was our last rehearsal. Unlike a lot of bands, on stage there were 4 equal members of Led Zeppelin. And they were not Led Zeppelin without each other. If one of them was missing, it wasn't the same. They were like brothers. They were so tightly knit, and what they had was incredibly rare and special. And as much as everyone wanted them to continue, the boys knew this was impossible, and they issued a statement. It said, "We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were." And Robert Plant said that his charisma on stage was reliant on John and on Jimmy and on John Paul, and it was the same for each one of them. That was the secret to their success. And of course, it was a huge blow to Jimmy and John Paul, but Robert and Bonham knew each other before Zeppelin, and he was never the same after he passed away. So life after Led Zeppelin would include Page and Plant reuniting in 1994 for MTV's Unplugged, and they decided to do a project together from 94 to 98. In 1995, Led Zeppelin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the guys were there to accept, along with Zoe and Jason, John Bonham's children. And in 2007, 39 years after their first rehearsal, the guys reunited in England at the O2 Arena, and 500 million, not a million, 500 million people tried to get tickets for that show. The fact that John Bonham's son Jason would join them would make it all the more special, and the band was totally humbled that after all these years, there would still be such an outpouring of love for them. And after that, Robert Plant reportedly turned down $200 million to do a reunion tour. Now my neighbor has a chainsaw. If y'all can hear that, I'm sorry, almost done. Over the years, the guys kept things pretty low-key. Robert would win a Grammy for Album of the Year with Alison Krauss in 2009 for a collaboration album they did together. It was very good. Jimmy and John Paul have continued to play over the years and stay busy with various artists, various projects. And I just want to note that John Paul Jones married his sweetheart in 1967, and they are still married. And I felt it worth noting because in the music business and in Hollywood, marriages barely last 40 weeks, much less 40 plus years. So I thought that was very sweet. John Bonham's legacy lives on in his son, Jason, who was skillfully playing drums by the age of 5. I mean, with him as your dad, I would imagine. So Jason not only fills in whenever the band calls him, he also has played with other artists like Hart, and he's been in several Sammy Hagar projects and bands. So he's keeping Dad's legacy alive. Led Zeppelin redefined rock music. And it wasn't just about a look or an idea. It was quality music with amazingly skilled musicians and a vocalist. It was innovative, it was unique, it was special, and their influence is still shaping artists today. So this is the look. I used the Novelist Secret palette, a bit of a throwback. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. This one was awesome for me. Fun fact for this video is I actually got to meet Robert Plant at a pool hall in Florida, and as much as I would like to say I played it cool, I did not.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
But he was very sweet and gracious, and I'm happy to have that memory. But I hope you guys will consider subscribing if you're not already. Give the video a like, it helps me so much, and let me know down in the comments your opinions, your stories, your thoughts. Leave me some ideas for the next video, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.